people ask me, for example, do you believe in God? And I think, well, I don't know what you are driving at with that question, because I don't know what you mean by believe. Most people, modern people, believe that a belief is a description of accordance with a set of facts.
Sure.
Right. Well, I don't think that's what belief means in the religious sense in the least. So I just think that's a non-starter.
For you, it's something to do with what you act out, right?
It has to do with what you believe is what you're willing to die for, fundamentally. It's what you're committed to or live for, if you think about it as life in the most extensive manner. It's a matter of commitment.
So I understand what you mean in the religious context.
Yeah.
So, but religion is a big topic. Religion is a mighty, area to be talking about. But when I talk about belief in a more mundane sense, like I believe that this chair exists.
Yeah.
Like that is a belief that I hold. I sort of can't help but hold that belief because I can see it. Right?
Well, that's a place where your action and your statements align.
Exactly.
Right.
Which is
you
why,
believe in the chair and you're sitting in it. It's like, fair enough.
Which is why I totally agree when you say that what you believe might really be what you act out. But I think when people are looking for essentially definitions, and just a second ago you said, well, what is it to believe? And you said, well, what you believe is what you're willing to die for.
Yeah.
I'm not willing to die for my belief that this chair exists.
Maybe
in a broad sense. If not believing that the chair existed required me to sort of give up my trust in my sense data,
right,
then I might literally die by accident by sort of walking off a cliff because I don't trust my eyes anymore. So it's
also not something that you're likely to forego given your role, let's say, as a rational skeptic.
That's right.
Seriously, like it's a commitment that you've made to a certain view of reality.
But you understand surely that when somebody asks, do you believe in God? Although they're asking the sort of subject of the belief is a much more grand entity, the word belief itself, for them, at least in their question, even if you think it's an inappropriate question, they mean something much more mundane. They mean like you believe in the existence
of chair. It's hard to know what people mean. Like one of the things I've noticed, for example, is there are no shortage of Christian trolls, right? I mean, there are atheist trolls and there's engineering trolls, there's lots of trolls, but there are Christian trolls. And the Christian trolls, when they ask that question, and it's often the Christian trolls who ask that question, what they mean is, are you in my club?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And my answer is, I'm not even sure you know what club you're in. So there's a trap in the question, which I don't appreciate because I don't like questions that have traps in them.
Yes.
Now, not everybody who's asking that question has a trap, but many people do. And so I find that off-putting, let's say, because it's manipulative. In terms of that descriptive belief, that's something we could go into. I think we should do that because it does get to the core of the matter that you were attempting to untangle, let's say, in your essay.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of and I had to sort of piece together different things you'd said in different interviews. And I suppose the reason I had to do that was because I didn't have you in front of me. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity now. It seems to me that when you speak of God, you mean something like that which is at the, I don't know if you'd rather say the basis or the top, but the basis or the top.
Both metaphors.
Of a value hierarchy. And it begins with the recognition that anything that anybody does requires some kind of value. Even just to do something as simple as sitting in a chair or picking up a glass.
Well, you don't do anything without it being oriented towards a value.
Exactly, right. And so even to perceive the glass is something you've spoken about before. Why do I see the glass as one object? Even though it's got multiple parts, it's got a side and a bottom and a top. I see them together in a way that I don't see the cup and the table as one object. Well, you said before, it's because I can grip it. It's sort of functional. It's because I can use this cup. And the reason that I see it in that way is because I can then drink from it. And the reason that I want to do that is because I sort of value my health. And there's sort of a value regress that goes on.
Always.
And more broadly, this comes out in the question of like, why are you writing an essay? To get a good grade. Or why do you want a good grade? To get a good job. Why do you want a good job? To get money. And you keep going back and back. It has to terminate somewhere.
That's right.
Because otherwise there would be nothing to sort of lend that value.
Well, otherwise you'd always be in an infinite regress.
Further down.
Right? You just die of questioning.
Or it would be infinite. Yeah, you literally, it's the kind of regress in which the value that you have for A actually borrows the value from B. You don't value A at all without B. So it doesn't get it without B. And B doesn't get it without C. And C doesn't get it without D. So if that went on infinitely, there's nothing to give the entire sequence value in the first place.
Right.
And so there's got to be something at the basis here. And then you said, at least on one occasion, that we'll call that place, whatever's at the top there, we'll call it the divine place.
Yeah,
and you said we'll make that
a matter of definition. Yeah.
Now, I'm fine with this.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that what you're doing is you're giving a definition of God that makes him
partial definition,
or makes it him, whatever, unavoidably exist, and also makes it a quite different entity to the entity described by a great deal of, for instance, your Christian listeners, who will say that God is not the basis of a value hierarchy. God is an omnipotent, omniscient, agential being with consciousness that intentionally brings about human beings and sent down a physical man to sacrifice his life in order to save us from our sins. Now, that means that when someone asks you, does God exist? And you say, well, look, I think that's almost an inappropriate question. At times you sort of imply that you don't even believe in atheists because you sort of act as if you believe in God. If what you mean by God is just...
Well, Dawkins himself admitted he was a cultural Christian.
That's another matter, because that's much more specific. I mean, that's cultural Christianity, right? This is just... This, but although
it's a reflection
saying that
of the same problem.
But you know, when a Christian says to you, I'm being very clear that that's what I mean by God. I don't know if you do believe in the omniscient, omnipotent, agential being, but if you start talking about the inevitability of believing in some basis of a value hierarchy...
Well, it's not so obvious.
You're talking about something different.
It's not so obvious from the traditional Judeo-Christian perspective that God is properly conceptualized as a being.
That's probably right too.
So it's tricky, right? Because one of the ways that you can approach God traditionally is in relationship to a being, but that's a veil. So why do I say that? Okay, so let's speak about it religiously first, and then we can speak about it conceptually. So there's a tremendous insistence in the Judeo-Christian tradition that God is outside of the categorical structure, right? Like seriously outside. Elijah, the prophet, establishes that God is not in nature. He's not in the earthquake. He's not in the conflagration. He's not in the storm, right? So that doesn't mean that nature doesn't speak of God, but it does mean that whatever God is not in the natural world. Okay, now we can extend that. Not bound by time, not bound by space. Well, does that make God a material object? Because when people say, is God real, which is a variant of the question, do you believe in God? It's like, well, God's immaterial and outside of time and space. So if your definition of real is material things in the domain of time and space, then we're not talking about the same thing. Now, usually people approach that question of belief with some materialistic framework like that in mind, even if they don't know it.
Yes.
The Christians, let's say, who put this question forward in the hope of getting the answer they want to hear, are materialistic and Enlightenment minds, even though they don't know it, because they have an implicit definition of what constitutes real. Is God real? It's like, no, God's hyper real. That's not the same thing.
I think that the physicality of God is an interesting question.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament tradition, it seems to evolve as far as I can see. If you look at some of the earlier descriptions of God, you've got a God who walks through the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
You've got a God who has a council of angels and the accuser. You have a sort of, it's being at least conceptualized as a much more physical being. And as time goes on, God becomes less localized. And I've heard a lot of theories as to why that's the case. I've just done an episode on my own show.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true exactly. I don't think there's a clear historical progression like that. There is a constant tension between God as ineffable and then God as manifest in a manner that's comprehensible, right? And so Mircea Eliade had mapped the consequences of this out to some degree. So he was very interested in Nietzsche's proposition that God had died. Most people, including Nietzsche, regarded that as like a unique historical event. There was a religious tradition, the Enlightenment arose. In consequence, we became skeptical about God. And in 1850, the philosophers decided that he was no longer necessary or real. But Eliade, who is a brilliant historian of religions, has noted that this has happened many, many times, that God has vanished, disappeared. And one of his explanations for that is that a God that's too ineffable, so that's completely outside of the categories of time and space, let's say, and who doesn't make himself present as a being, who doesn't have a heavenly council, who has no hierarchy between the pinnacle and earth itself, tends to float off into space. It becomes so abstract that you can't have a relationship with him, and then he disappears.
In many ways, this is what Christianity provides with the New Testament and the figure of Jesus. And that's why I think for a lot of Christians, the more important question for you and the question that they're interested in. And you're quite right that a lot of people are like, I want to get you on my team.
Yeah.
I have no dog in this fight. I'm not a Christian.
Yeah.
But I know that a lot of Christians are frustrated when they begin asking about Jesus, who's a much more physical entity, right? It's a real human being. It's someone of flesh and blood. It's someone who's physically crucified by the Romans.
It's a very different question. It's a very different question.
And then is seen as a physical entity, at least according to the canonical tradition, by his disciples after he died.
Yeah.
So when somebody asks you, do you believe that that happened? And when I've seen you asked about that question, you tend to still speak in terms of the psychological and the mythological. I think the frustration is that, as you've just said, these are
I
two
don't
different
mind
conversations,
frustrating
right?
Christians in that regard either, because the truth of the matter is, with regard to the gospel accounts, that the mythological and the historical are inextricably cross-contaminated.
Sure.
There's no pulling out the historical Jesus, right? That's a non-starter. And why that is, I don't know. It's very mysterious. It's very hard to understand, as are the, let's say, the accounts of the resurrection. Okay, so what do I think about that? Well, I think that denying the historical reality of Christ I think that's just a fool's errand.
Of course.
I don't know why anybody would bother with it.
So a man exists called Jesus. We have that much.
Now, there's a claim that is attributed to Christ that he is the embodiment or the incarnation, the fulfillment, let's say, of the prophet and the laws.
Yes.
I think that's true. Yeah.